Hello and welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to talk about is availability zones with Azure Logic Apps standard. Let's go. So a little bit about why this episode is important. So business continuity / disaster recovery can be a complex and expensive initiative or exercise. Generally, you're dealing with some complexity or challenges around managing endpoints where you may have different data centers and URLs or URIs change from one to another. Naturally, managing state, if you had to fail over, at what point do you sort of pick up the transactions that were in process, and how do you know that you haven't missed one? Concurrency, like what happens if both of the data centers are up at the same time? How do you manage that? And then testing. Testing's naturally usually pretty expensive. You usually have to create an isolated network. You go ahead and make sure all of your applications are deployed, all of your assemblies are in place, all of the applications that need to call your interfaces have been updated to point to the new URL. It goes on and on and on, and especially more difficult in your on-premises middleware days, but still with cloud, there's still some challenges as well. Within Azure, we've got a feature called Availability Zone that increases redundancy within an Azure region. This can help address the organization's BCDR needs without introducing a lot of friction for developers, such as the challenges I just talked about. Now, something to be aware of, this isn't available in all regions, so you do need to choose your regions wisely. When you provision an app service instance, in our case, it's like a workflow instance, app service plan, you need to provision a minimum of 3. And this 3 is going to give you the redundancy, and we're going to see why on the next slide, but just be aware of that. So in this video, we're going to be talking about standard, but do stay tuned. There's more information coming down shortly about consumption, so we'll talk a bit more about it at that point. Okay, let's dive in. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what is an Azure Availability Zone here. So on the screen here, and I've grabbed this from the Microsoft documentation, we have this square that represents an Azure region. Now, within select regions, and that's why you have to be careful about which region you're deploying your assets in order to take advantage of this feature. But what we actually have is 3 physical data centers that are not connected to each other. There's some distance between them that helps deal with environmental type situations where, for example, you've got sort of, say, power outage to one of those facilities, or there's like a network connection that's been severed, by accident or whatnot. And so what this allows us to do is, have some redundancy within a region itself. And so this is important to understand. I think oftentimes, typical organizations, they'll have a DR site, like it's another site that's going to have some distance away. Like sometimes it could be in the same city, but could be, 10, 15, 20, 30 kilometers apart, or obviously longer than that. And, obviously these values will vary, and Microsoft doesn't, expose this info publicly. So it's hard to know exactly what the distance would be, but what you do have is redundancy within a specific region itself. Now, if you had, catastrophic earthquake, who knows what would be impacted, but this does give you some additional durability and redundancy, and you're able to take advantage of this, without a whole lot of friction for you to actually have to deal with itself. A lot of it is just taken care of from a Microsoft perspective. And so what is actually happening when you go ahead and deploy a resource and enable availability zones is that you are creating a scale set across those availability zones. So zone 1, 2, and 3. And so what that means is when you go ahead and provision these resources, you're essentially provisioning at least 3 of them, 3 of those specific instances. And that gives them independent power, network, and cooling. So what you're getting is additional availability, additional redundancy within a specific Azure region itself. Now, if you truly wanted to do like Azure region to Azure region type replication, that's outside of the scope of this video, but what you do have is some additional redundancy, which should give you some comfort that you've got some additional capabilities here. Now, if we think about routing, because this was something that I was curious about when I was looking into this, was that traffic is routed to all of your available app service instances. So when we're talking about Logic Apps, we are essentially providing an app service plan, and we are deploying our instances into app service itself. And so as you can see here in the docs, that when a zone goes down, the app service platform will detect the lost instances and automatically attempt to find new replacement instances and spread traffic as needed. If you have autoscale configured, it will take care of that as well, and we'll try to provision additional instances as well. And so this is, I don't know, like if I look back a few years ago, like this was kind of the dream of always having like active configuration, because let's be honest, testing for BCDR is a pain. It's a pain because it's always been difficult to ensure that you've got your configuration data, all of your storage replicated, all of your applications and your binaries replicated across all your live site and your DR site. But what we're seeing here is more of this active type configuration, where you will have workloads essentially sprayed across all of your instances, and this is all abstracted away from you, and Microsoft is taking care of this behind the scenes for you, so you don't have to really worry about it. And so it's something where you can actually go ahead and go to your leadership and say, yes, like I've gone ahead and deployed some Logic Apps within an availability zone, and I have 3 instances of it running at all times. And so should one of those instances go down, I have 2 others that are picking up the workload, and automatically Microsoft will go ahead and try to provision another instance as well. So I always have 3 that are running. And this is outside of the auto scale type capabilities as well. So the next question you might be asking is, okay, great, how much does this cost? Now this is where the documentation is a little bit ambiguous, but if you read it, it does make sense. So there's no cost for the feature of enabling Azure Availability Zones. But what you do end up paying for is essentially the service itself based upon how many instances you have. So if there's a minimum of 3 instances required as part of an availability zone, well, now you're paying for 3. And so this is always that sort of double-edged sword, if you will, where you might be asked, okay, great, we've got these new capability, we can have these availability zones and get some additional redundancy and in theory high availability. However, you do pay for it. Like you're going to be paying for those additional instances. But if you also look at this as if it is active, it does mean it's being used. I think in the past there's always that kind of like warm standby where it always feels like you're kind of throwing money out unless you really need it. It's kind of like an insurance policy. Whereas here you can kind of look at it maybe more as like a scale out feature in itself, that you're just able to spread your load across multiple instances. So that's something to think about, when you go through this. It's definitely not something you want to just turn on just for the heck of it. It should be grounded in some sort of real business need from that perspective. But the beauty of this is that the overhead to manage this is very negligible, right? As opposed to thinking back to sort of prior, situations where I had to deal with DR for, say, BizTalk server farms. That's a whole different situation. We're talking projects, we're talking tons of testing, and a lot of coordination as well. So this definitely is positive. Now, how do I enable availability zones? So when I go ahead and deploy an Azure Logic Apps standard instance, we see this check mark or this option at the bottom of our provisioning experience, and this is available through the CLI as well, so it's not just portal. But here what we're doing is selecting that we want to enable app service plan, and apps in the zone will be redundant. The minimum app service plan instance count will be 3. So I will have 3 of these instances running for me, in this case within West US 2. As I mentioned earlier, not all regions have availability zones, but there's quite a few, so you should be able to find something that works for you from that perspective. So this is what I would do when I go to provision my Logic App standard instance. After it's gone ahead and been provisioned, I headed over to my Logic App standard instance. I then clicked on scale out, and when I clicked on scale out, I saw that we've got 3 minimum instances required here, and that I currently have 3 always ready instances as well. And so what this means is that Microsoft will try to ensure that we always have 3 instances available, and as a result that will be spread out within different availability zones within a single region. And so, this is kind of where the magic is, in the sense that I don't have to sort of manage this. Microsoft's going to take care of it and provide me assurances around, having redundancy inside of a region itself. And so that's kind of the extent of what you sort of need to do. The rest of it is, when we go to run history, we're not sort of need to know like where things are running. Those requests are being sprayed across to the various app service plans that exist. That concludes today's video. As I said earlier on, do look for something in the not so distant future about consumption, but this is something that you should definitely look into as you think about Logic Apps and high availability and business continuity, disaster recovery planning. Really an opportunity to simplify your life and simplify your organization's life, and not have to deal with a lot of the hard things about like repointing and having to keep all your apps deployed and up and synced and up to date across all of your sort of production and DR instances. So pretty cool from that perspective. Thanks again for checking out this video, and we'll see you soon on the channel. Thanks. Take care.